Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a series of conversations between Glenn Ford, a games designer, and me, Mike Hutchinson, also a games designer, on the many and varied rainbow of topics that we call designing better miniature games. And we talk about designing better miniature games, although Glenn does design some games that aren't miniature games. I don't tend to. But therein, that little subheading is sort of the topic that I'm heading in the direction of with this rambling preamble, which is sometimes you can make a miniature game and sometimes you can come up with an idea that might not be a miniature game or might not best be expressed as a miniature game. And I guess Glennon quite explicitly goes through a process where he has an idea and goes, oh, what about this game? And then he looks it in the face and goes, are you a miniature game? Do you really need miniatures? Whereas I tend to back into this in a slightly different way where I go, ooh, miniatures! What are all the things that I can do with them? And the question, should this be a miniatures game, has barely ever occurred to me. And given that level of rigor in my thinking, Glenn was writing a piece of writing recently to address this question that keeps coming up, which is, hey, I've got this idea for a game. Is this a good idea for a game? And the idea might be, well, actually, there's some things in this idea that suit a card game better, or a board game better, or a live action role playing game as an expression of this core idea. So Glenn's got some specific areas that he thinks are worth consideration when you're thinking about whether something is good for a miniatures game. And individually, each one of them sounds sane and logical, and I don't understand them. And so I thought it would be lovely to have a series of conversations where through Socratic discourse, I discover what it is that Glenn means by these things. And hopefully my ignorance will be illuminated, and thus yours as the audience member simultaneously, and that will be content.
Splendid, yes.
So I think we should probably just preface this by saying, for the purposes of this conversation, we believe that there are like two core affordances of miniature games, the kinds of miniature games that we make. And one of them is that they're obsessed with spatial relationships between markers and the absolute distance and the relative positioning of them. And when we say markers, those can be, miniatures, or they can be the scale terrain and buildings and whatnot. But the game is obsessed with the spatial relationships. And so there's a very specific core affordance here, which is, well, given that we're obsessed with those things and we give players tools to measure them and adjudicate them, then you can create very complicated physical situations and physical relationships. And that's the first. And the second is that these games that we talk about can accommodate an enormous diversity of physical objects in a way that's almost unlike any other game. So if we're playing Warhammer 40,000 and we put a shoe on the table, perhaps not a cat, maybe that bucks the trend, but a shoe, we can easily just say, well, let's just count that as obscuring terrain for now. And the game will willingly accept and accommodate the vast diversity.
Yeah. Whereas conversely, and it's a sort of reverse definition in a way, because if you're playing Monopoly and you stick a shoe onto the board, the game itself has no concept of how to engage with that object. It's an order of idea that can't even begin to be grasped by it. And I think those are certainly some things that these sorts of games do that other games can't do, and that these sorts of games are interested in. But I think one thing that has popped up certainly a few times recently in like the Discord and various conversations, which might be getting towards where there's a sort of borderline thing, is like single model combat tabletop games. Like particularly, there's certainly a rise at the moment in like 75mm scale minis, and there are quite a few people going, there's all these amazing 75mm scale minis, we should totally be able to do a game with them, or I'll do a game where each person's only got one mini. And very quickly it gets to a place of where like it's incredibly hard to make the spatial relationship interesting then. And what you often end up with, somebody is going, well, we'll get these two minis together and then it will be about like where you're hitting, and I'll represent where you're hitting with cards and counters and tokens. And then after a little while, it's just like, it's just not a minis game at that point. It's there's a little bit of preamble of moving the minis round, and then it's just a cards and counters game, and you should just make a cards and counters game.
Right, because the central relationship between the two models has ceased to be important or relevant really to the game.
Yeah, it's super hard to make a one mini per side.
Unless you have posable arms and you can only move your arm a certain number of centimeters.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, and this is one of the things that's super hard, particularly about like human skirmishing minis with one model per side, particularly if it's a combat-based game. It's like, well, okay, we've both got guns. You want to draw a bead on me, so you move around and then get line of sight on me. No matter where you've gone, whatever you've done, what I then do is go, well, pivot. There we go. Now our relationship is completely like relationally the same. I just pivot on the spot. I don't even need to move. And to keep that interesting when you can so easily, because me seeing you and you seeing me is like relationally identical. It's incredibly hard to make that interesting and useful and work as a minis game. But yeah, as you said, I've sort of broken down some of the other things that I think are an indicator as to why you might not want to make a minis game or why you might want to make a board game. And I think you've got like some of them in a list, and we might talk about one of them in this conversation and then move on to some of the others.
Yeah, that sounds right. That sounds right. So let's hit skills and abstraction. So this is thinking about what you might wish to abstract and what you might wish to simulate, and where there are potentially transferable or non-transferable skills, and how all that bears on the decision about whether this is it or is not best expressed as a miniature game.
Yeah, and this is, I think, less of a sort of dividing line, that you straddle one way or the other, and more a sort of principle of guidance, maybe. So I think that whenever you make a game, there are some skills of the player that you are trying to test with that game, and some other skills that you're going to abstract out or drop off, or that you're not really just that interested in. So, for example, the game of snooker, the sport of snooker, has a lot of specific skills to do with like how you use a cue and how you screw a ball back and all those sorts of things. And it also has judging angles, which is like a transferable human skill. Like, well, if I hit that thing at a certain angle, it will bounce off at another angle, or just aiming at a thing. And it also has the skill of like strategy within snooker, where you're like, oh, well, I want to leave the cue ball behind that ball so he can't then get to that other ball. And so there's sort of three general areas. There's the specific snooker skills of how you handle a cue, the sort of dexterity game.
Right, the physical skills that you've developed.
Yeah, there's the transferable skills of judging angles and, just physically aiming. And then there's the strategic skills that kind of aren't transferable, because like whether or not it's a good idea to leave a cue ball behind, a black ball isn't a strategic judgment that is transferable to many other things. And then there are various games that have recreated snooker, like on the tabletop and in computer games, and they tend to, by necessity, abstract out the screwing a ball back, the way you maneuver a cue and all those sorts of things. Like there's tons of computer games, digital games, that definitely have the judgment of angles, definitely have aiming, definitely have strategy, and then you like press a button to make it so that the ball screws back.
So if we change the example to soccer,
sure,
for the purposes of having access to like Sabutio, and so clearly flicking a little Sabutio, what Weeble Wobble man, isn't the same physical skill as kicking the ball on the field, but potentially like where to position my players at a given point in the game's evolution, or like what the angle that is going to be able to hit the goal. Like obviously the ball is a different size and weight and stuff, but like there's enough physical analog that maybe some of those transferable skills for angles and stuff might be relevant in Sabutio as they are in striking on a goal in the park.
Yeah, and so generally for games, like assuming that the game you're making is recreating some form of a reality, even if it's fantasy, sci-fi reality, then there's presumably going to be a protagonist within your game, and the protagonist is presumably going to be evidencing certain skills throughout the passage of the game. And I think that deciding whether or not the skills you want them to evidence are, you know, the literal skills that the protagonist is evidencing, and those are going to have to be transferable skills because you are not going to put the player in the literal situation of the protagonist. Which of those skills you're going to abstract out, how you are then going to abstract them out, goes a long way towards guiding you, I think, in whether or not you're going to design a miniatures game. So, for example,
Mm.
I've spoken a few times about how, like, one of the things that's interesting about miniatures games is that a great general, and I think the reason that like miniatures games of simulation are miniatures games is that we have an idea that a great general stands literally on a hill above a battlefield, like Waterloo, Wellington literally was sat within eyesight of the battlefield on a horse, you
Mm.
know, and looks at the positions of the various men and judges who can move to a certain direction, who can get to a certain place before they're intercepted, who can overpower somebody else by looking at the battlefield and judging the flow of battle. And a lot of the time, that is the thing we are kind of trying to recreate with a tabletop miniatures game. And so then the sort of the transferable skills of judging distances and movement rates and sort of empathically putting yourself into someone's position and figuring out what they can or can't see, like the charge of the light brigade, is a famous historic instance where a general said to pass a message to somebody something based upon the fact that the general could see something that the guy receiving the message couldn't, and that was a blunder of a general, that he was unable to sort of transfer his consciousness into what his men could see before telling them something. And I think that if those sorts of skills about sort of being able to like transfer your consciousness around to different places, being able to judge whether somebody can see something from a place separate from yourself, being able to judge movement rates and sort of the relationships of spaces, on the tabletop. If those are the transferable skills you're interested in, then super easy choice. You want to be making a minis game. Um, and then if the things you want to abstract are the things about how a bloke hits another bloke with a sword, and you're happy to put that into a dice roll or the flip of a card or something like that, yes, again, minis games, absolutely brilliant. Now, if you want that sword play to be less abstracted, and obviously, not obviously, but probably you're not going to ask your players to start whacking each other in the face with swords. Although, if you're writing a live action role playing game, maybe you are. But
Mm.
maybe you're like, okay, well, I don't want to actually get them to hit each other with swords, but there is a bluff and sort of judgment and involved within a sword fight. Maybe I want to create some sort of bluffing mechanism within my game. Well,
Mm.
how am I going to do that? Am I going to use certain like components? And this is where you start looking at something like X-wing, where with its little dials and its bits and pieces and its extra lovely splendidness, which means it has to be more of a packaged game. And then like
But
as
at the same time, that game feels like it's about making judgments as the pilot in a spaceship that may or may not get through that gap between the
hmm,
X-wing and the enemy, between the asteroid and the enemy fighter. And so, like,
yeah, absolutely.
you're still testing, as you're saying, like, you're still testing something in the area of that, like judging distance, judging movement rates,
No,
transferring the sort of perspective.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that X-Wing is definitely still a minis game, but it's sort of starting down that path into where there's some more things that are less abstracted and are more sort of product heavy. And then like, if what you are interested in the battle game or the fight, like I say, if we go back to that single miniatures game, you're not really interested in the movement of the minis and their relationship and whether they can see each other. You're interested much more in, you know, okay, I'm either going to go for a high stance or a low stance, and you're going to try and either duck or jump. And it's like, well, the minis aren't doing any of those things.
Mm.
You're representing all of those things, all of the meat of the game, all the things you're interested in, the bluffing and the exchange. You're going to be representing with cards and tokens and non-mini things. The whole game is going to be played sort of away from the minis. And I think sometimes we're sort of like, okay, well, what I want to do is I want to simulate a bunch of guys like shooting at and fighting a bunch of other guys. Probably it's a minis war game. I just get on designing a minis war game. And sometimes you know, I've looked at some prototype games and it's like, it feels like what you're interested in here is a quite abstract relationship between like a monster and a human, where, you know, the human's getting scared and the monster's chasing them, and like, well, the chasing and the running away bit on the tabletop is a little bit sort of rudimentary. Not the monster always moves towards them, they always move away. The monster moves towards them, they always move away. But whenever the monster moves towards them, it uses a special scare ability, and the human is using a certain sort of hiding, etc. And it's like, well, the interesting bit are these slightly abstracted things that are the relationship between them. That would be just much smoother and simpler, you know, as a card game where you're picking the different attacks the monster is making. You know, if there isn't crunch and interest and play within the physical relationship of the things on the tabletop, a lot of, you know, surprisingly often I think sometimes in these games the physical movement of moves around the tabletop is um quite rudimentary and quite sort of like the bit you're least paying attention to. It's like, I absolutely.
And that's, you're not saying there that like movement rules have to be complicated, but simply that they have to be meaningful, or the position that you move them into has to be super meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't believe that complexity gives like meaning. I think that, like, you know, you can have a handful of markers moved in an incredibly simple way around the tabletop. And the beauty, I think, of tabletop miniatures games, because they're non-discrete relationship, is that really simple rules could describe incredibly complex situations, because there's like an infinite, you know, range of spaces and differences. You know, I mean, Puke Apocalypse is basically about like, put two things roughly a certain distance together, guess whether or not a handful of chips will span the space between them.
Mm.
And it's like, that's super simple, but it's like, I don't know if I can eyeball whether these chips will do that spread. You know, it is inherently quite an interesting thing, and like, where can I move to be able to put the chips in the places that I want them to go. And so I think like, a lot of the time, I mean, not a lot of the time, but some of the time, I see minis games and I sort of feel like you're not really that interested in what is happening on the tabletop. You're interested in what has been abstracted by your game because it is a minis game. Whereas what I want is you to go over to the thing you're interested in, abstract it a bit less, chuck the minis out the window, get a bit more deep into the thing that your game is actually about, and your game is actually sort of making fun and enjoyable for me, and maybe make that less abstracted, maybe put in something that pulls me more into that thing. It's like, if it is a monster chasing somebody, and like the really interesting bit is the little play of like the attack and the defense between the monster and the human being, maybe stick in a little something where the human has to like do something tension inducing to choose their attack. You know, flip a coin and catch it in midair, or just something to give me that a little moment of, oh, that was quite tense and I wasn't sure about that, and it was about me rather than just some dice or another abstracted thing. But you're not doing that. You're abstracting it with dice because you're tied to these minis to be the non-abstracted thing in your game. They are the thing that has to carry the physical meaning and the transferable skills to the players, and they are not the thing that your game is about. So you're putting the transferable skills, the human connection, into a bit of the game, which is the wrong bit of the game to be putting the people into. Put them into the thing that the game is about. That possibly is a way of sort of kind of what I meant about that, that sort of that part of the set of ideas. And so
Right. So like definite clues that you're making a not miniatures game are, as you move towards abstracting the position of miniatures, if you move towards the abstraction of the relationships, if you can sort of death by a thousand cuts this to a degree where you can be like, well, what if ranges are sort of don't matter and everything's kind of got infinite ranges, and what if everyone's got a 360-degree line of fire, and what if it doesn't really matter if you get around behind someone, and you add all of these what ifs together and you end up with something where you've essentially abstracted all of the interesting sort of physical relationship guts of why you would bother using models in 3D space. And you've ended up something with that, at the very least could be on gridded stuff, but probably could just be a card game because actually it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, like, looking to the cinematography of things in a weird way can be kind of beneficial. Like, I wasn't watching it. I was watching a video about the crimes of Grindelwald, the Fantastic Beasts sequel. And there's a duel in that where two people are dueling by basically pointing wands at each other, and fire comes out of it, meets in the middle, and then the fire moves sort of back and forth between them. And nothing's really physically happening on screen because presumably the whole fight is like a very internalized sort of abstracted process of, I'm straining my magic muscle. God, I've got to like outwit his spell, which you don't represent on the screen. It doesn't happen physically on the screen, and so it's a terrible climax for a movie. And if you're like, oh, I want to make this game that's like about a wizard's duel, and what happens is two wizards look at each other, and then a bunch of stuff happens in their head. Maybe not a minis game, because the stuff that happens in their head, you're gonna represent that with some sort of like board where there are like places and an area control thing, and this
and it'll look like a euro, and there'll be little tokens of different power levels moving around, and you'll be placing your workers for which spell mana, which channel of the wand it's going down.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you don't you don't want to make a Harry Potter Wizards Duel miniatures game, between two people, because it's just, well, they both look at each other and then completely throw the tabletop out and go off to an abstracted board and figure out whatever the rules are of casting a spell are in the Harry Potter universe. And that's the actual game. And the minis are just an irritant that's
I can't remember which book it is. I think it's one of the Ravener books, one of the 40k Ravener books, where two characters having a psychic duel essentially results in them like flying over the city and like smashing through all kinds of different things in a sort of superhero fight. Like, that's super physical. It's like really, it's got all kinds of like obstacles, and they possess other people, and it's really like, you can imagine that as a miniatures game because it has all of the things that you need about, occluded movement, and whether I can see people at a certain moment, and how far I throw them, and now what's the range between us.
And I think it's like there are a couple of games that are a bit like this, the one-to-one scale games. And I think it's like, if you were doing a superhero sort of minis game, it would work best, I think, as a one-to-one scale game where the dudes are literally fighting around your house and throwing each other through shelves and smashing each other through your fridge, because you need that much space for a proper superhero fight where someone's flying over a city. And I think, like, relating this back to a possibly topical thing within miniatures gaming, and something that has played Warhammer Fantasy Battle is like the hero hammer problem. And like hero hammer, particularly back in 3rd and 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, the main problem with it was the flying high rule, where a flying hero on a flying monster could take off completely off of the battlefield into this entirely abstracted location. And if you had 2 people doing that, they could fight a duel in this totally abstracted location.
You say totally abstracted. It was always on top of a hill next to the other guy so that they could take a photo of it for the battle report.
I had a friend who had a blue painted shelf
Right.
specifically for it, so they both went off on the
Perfect.
painted shelf and sat there. But the thing is,
Right, but the point is they violate the spatial relationship at that point.
absolutely, it's in this thing. And when Hero Hammer was like at its peak, the whole game was these 2 dudes sitting in an abstracted physical relationship, rolling dice at each other, and then one of them coming down and just annihilating the entire table. And movement didn't matter because he just flew around and he ate through units like they weren't even there. And that's an instance where like that 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle should probably not have been a minis game. It should have just been a Hero Hammer card game, and whoever wins like the Hero Hammer card game, now that hero obviously devastates the battlefield. We won't make you go through the rigmarole of driving your dragon across a battlefield. But
at the same time, that was an era of Warhammer that had, estimating ranges, no pre-measuring, estimating charge distances.
Well, it was but not if you were flying high, because
if you were
flying high, you
flying
just
high,
landed directly into the combat you picked. And it was always the weird thing about like 4th and 5th edition. It was sort of like the 2 psychopaths took off, and then you had a fairly good game of Warhammer Fantasy Battle.
Quick, let's have a game. Let's have a war game before they get finished.
Yeah, on the tabletop, as these 2 lunatics just bad each other out, and then you're like, oh wow. If not for those 2 guys, it looks like you would have won this actual game of Warhammer Fantasy Battle that we're having. But unfortunately for you, Rarge! There we go. That solved that problem.
Right. So I think you mentioned a phrase a moment ago, which I think perhaps transfers us to the next part of this conversation. So you mentioned transferable skills, and obviously the mastery of spatial relationships, spoilers, is going to be key to what the transferable skills are. But I think we can continue this dissection of when should something be a miniatures game and how might I tell in a subsequent part of this conversation. So for now, I think
yeah, we'll sign off. If you are struggling with whether or not to make a game into an minis game, maybe you started writing something and found out that the bit that was interesting was away from the actual minis, and you're caught in a conundrum of whether to sort of remake it as a different game, please swing down to the comments section, let us know, talk us through it. Maybe we can come up with some alternatives. And swing by the Discord, have that conversation again, because there are people on there sort of working through those problems. If you enjoyed the video and you're down in the comments section, please hit like and subscribes. And if you're following links that are down in the link section, follow the one across to Mike's Patreon, sign up to Mike's Patreon, and encourage the channel to continue being what it is and doing what it does.
Glenn will just keep doing this forever, but I gotta get paid, people.
Yeah, I'll be here on my own if you Underworld eventually. I'll just have a mic.
You don't want to see that, honestly.
Yeah, but for now and from this episode of Rule of Carnage, I think it will be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye.
Cheers, bye.